Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Fernando Zaragoza from Argentina. Me and my colleague Alejandro Perugorria from this country too. We organized one seminar related. This webinar is called Transnational Crime Perspectives and Prospectives, and we asked five speakers from different countries that try to give some information, to give uh, dissertations about these topics. In the case, in first term, we are going to have a, a magistral dissertation from Celina Realuccio. Selina is going to talk about following the money trail to combat terrorism, crime, and corruption in the age of COVID-19. Then I will give some information about Selina. Then we have the participation of Marcus Reyes, Gabriela Nava, and Luis Fernando de Asa Rosso. They three are going to speak about criminal organization in South America, the case of Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And finally, we have the participation of Alfonso Aragon from Mexico. He will talk about transnational organized crime, the state under siege. All of them are brilliant professionals in these topics, and all of them they are graduated from William Perry Center or Marshall Center. Uh, I think they have all qualifications and experience to make a great dissertation. I expect you enjoy these participations, and the idea is to give another seminars related different criminal organizations in continents. Next week we are going to have another great professionals too. First of all, I'm going to introduce Celina Realullo. Celina, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to introduce some some information about Celina. Celina is many of us know who is Celina. Celina is for me one of the best professors in terms of criminal organization, organized crime. She is a professor of practice at the William Perry Center for the Hemispheric Defense Students at the National Defense University, and she is a specialist in illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, threat finance issues in the Americas. She had an extensive CV, and I asked her to. She gave us she gave us a presentation related to money laundering. There's no many and so good professional in this topic, and really I think is one field that Selena could give a lot of information and a lot of training in this topic. Selena, if you want, you can start your dissertation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, both to Alejandro and Fernando, for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. As many of you know, I spent time as a diplomat and then as a banker, and spent a lot of time looking at terrorism and crime, and more importantly, the financing piece. Because there's so many people who are looking, including myself, at the impact of the pandemic on transnational organized crime, I thought today that I would choose to actually focus much more on the financing because there's not that many people who are doing that. but even more importantly, because I think it's important because everything that these groups do has to do with the money, and it's being very impacted by the global pandemic. So let me start my presentation, and let's see if it works here. Great. Can you see the presentation, Fernando?
No, we can see. We can see.
Hold on.
Let me see. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
It's okay. It's in there. Okay. So what we've seen.
Okay.
It's okay. Okay, good. So we've always looked at groups, whether they be terrorist or criminal in nature, mostly focused on what we call the leadership and command and control. It's only in the past 10 to 15 years that we've started to look at other enablers, such as following the money trail and the importance of financial intelligence. So what we're going to do is take a look at how these illicit networks around the world are empowered by globalization, but even more so, how a lot of them share the same supply routes and the same facilitators, such as financiers. And what we're seeing right now with the coronavirus pandemic is all of these global supply chains are being affected. So historically, we've actually seen that we always talked about global supply chains. And this is something that in the private sector, whether you're Walmart or Apple or Coca-Cola, are actually grappling with now with all the COVID-19 lockdowns, and more importantly, the actual paralysis of global trade. So we always look at these four critical elements: what the material, what is actually moving through the supply chain, who's moving it or who's securing it in terms of manpower, and then mechanisms, whether it's going by land, sea, air, or now in cyberspace. But most importantly, the money piece. Who's actually financing that? And that's an important section that we're going to be looking at today. So as you all know, these illicit activities of drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms, exotic animals, wildlife, and gold are not new. But what is actually new in the world of globalization is the velocity, the magnitude, the wealth, and sadly in Latin America, the violence that accompanies it. And what's happening right now is that there's huge disruption of all these illicit activities because of COVID-19. So as I mentioned earlier, we think about critical enablers of illicit networks, whether they be criminal organizations or gangs or terrorist groups or insurgencies. We had always historically looked at that top box, which was leadership, trying to neutralize or decapitate different groups. Through the experience of the US military in Afghanistan and Iraq, we started to expand that understanding of illicit networks to basically capture how are they supporting themselves through illicit activities, what's the type of environment they need, mostly corruption, in order to thrive, how are they leveraging technology and logistics in order to support their evil agendas, how are they accessing weapons, and how are they recruiting and maintaining their personnel. So each of these critical enablers in and of themselves is important, but all of them have one thing in common that they need, which is actually the financing. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So just to define terms, I know several of you actually have been students at the Perry Center. We always try to distinguish between money laundering, which is trying to basically make clean the illicit proceeds from criminal activities, versus terrorist financing, which can actually come from clean money or donations. And the most important piece that we've seen in terrorist investigations over the past 20 years is something called the material support of terrorism, that we use not in the United States, but in Europe and Canada as well. Following the money is something very important. And then more importantly, we ask who financed a specific terrorist act or a terrorist group. And then we use this law, which is the material support of terrorism, in order to go after the financiers. So there's only one slide that you should remember from today's lecture. It's this one. How is the group raising money? Is it from legal activity, criminal activity, from donors in the case of terrorists? How are they physically moving that money from one point to another? How are they keeping and storing the money? And then how are they spending the money? So when we teach terrorist financing and money laundering, we emphasize different parts of the cycle depending on what you're actually looking at. So when I teach a lot of the FBI agents about following the money, we spend a lot of time looking at the expenses, that red bubble, because that actually are indicators of a group or an individual who's trying to spend money in order to select targets, surveil, buy the components in order to realize a terrorist attack. When we take a look at how money is moved, and this is what's so interesting, is it's very diversified. The most popular way is still through banks, because it's the most reliable, and more importantly, no bank can actually 100% assure that there isn't money laundering, terrorist financing taking place in their different activities and their transactions, which are in the billions per day. The second method is actually physically carrying cash across borders, which is called bulk cash smuggling. We also see on your left side trade-based money laundering, which is the over and under invoicing of goods in order to basically do a dual purpose of the transactions. You're actually moving product, but you're overcharging for it in order to move dirty money. We also have seen that money services businesses and remittances are still very popular. And then more recently, we're looking at a lot more activity in cyberspace with mobile banking, internet banking, and then cryptocurrencies, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We also see how they do store of value cards. These are prepaid cards, which are now taking off in all of Latin America. And then the most famous, which is actually what the Panama Papers expose was all about, was the creation of front companies in order to launder money or move money to terrorist groups. So what's happening now, what's different, is that even pre-pandemic, we already saw that the illicit economy was really becoming empowered, if not taking place, not just in the physical world, but in the cyber world. And this is where we've seen a lot more activity, criminal activity through the darknet, and then more importantly, these transactions that are increasingly paid for by cryptocurrencies. The one you're probably most familiar with is actually Bitcoin. So we've been using for the last 20 years this concept of following the money trail to go after terrorism, crime, and corruption. And we do this through three specific missions. The first one is actually pursuing and conducting law enforcement and intelligence operations. The second one, that's quite public and very diplomatic, is actually naming, shaming, and sanctioning individuals, groups, or countries. And the third pillar of this strategy is actually capacity building. So let's take a look at each of these pillars on their own. Perhaps the most infamous case was the financing of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. So just to remember, it was almost 3,000 people killed on the course of one day, and the attacks cost about $500,000. It was perpetrated by just 19 hijackers. And then more importantly, all the money was actually moved into the United States in US banks. And at that time, we didn't know how to determine what could be a terrorist financing activity. So that was a basic building block from which a lot of bank compliance and anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing began in the wake of 9/11. More recently, we're seeing these investigations enter the cyber world. And just in 2018, it was the first major investigation of a drug trafficking case. And it took place between Colombia and Spain. And it was a case of drug laundering the proceeds of cocaine trafficking in Europe in the amount of 8.4 euros. So this is an example of how in our law enforcement investigations, when we follow the money, we have to be up to date and more importantly, follow the new trends of what these criminal groups are trying to use in order to move their money and then finance themselves. The second pillar of the counter-threat finance strategy has been very public in the public domain and newspapers with headlines every day in terms of sanctions against countries, Iran, North Korea, and we've been particularly active in the past year with Venezuela, sanctioning the bulk of Maduro and his associates, and more importantly, taking a look at actual sectoral sanctions against the oil and gold sectors in Venezuela, which is the first of its kind. The idea, too, is that you would actually freeze these assets and then at some point be able to return those assets to their rightful owner. So when there is a change in government post-Maduro, these proceeds of illegally gotten gains of assets that are held overseas would then be returned to Venezuela's rightful democratic government in the future. And the third piece is actually how do you build the capacity in order to better detect and then more importantly prosecute crimes that are financial in nature, whether they be associated with criminals or with terrorist groups. So the first piece is you actually have to have a legal framework in which you criminalize terrorist financing and money laundering and the different variations of that. And that's where we're working right now in many countries on how to include digital or cryptocurrencies now under that kind of umbrella. The second one is working with the private sector and the financial regulatory space so that banks and other financial institutions know what to look for in terms of suspicious transactions. And then more importantly, how do they communicate those to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which is the blue box, which collaborates with other agencies and collects all of these suspicious transactions to then build a case, working with law enforcement to then investigate those who are implicated in financial crimes. Then lastly, prosecutions, to bring those who finance crime and terrorism to justice. We've been exporting this type of model around the world, and the Financial Action Task Force is quite important, setting the international norms to combat terrorist financing and money laundering. So we've always heard about this convergence of illicit networks where terrorism and crime actually share not just operating space, but also facilitators. And that is really true about the financing. So here are just a couple of examples of where this convergence has taken place around the world. In Afghanistan, notorious for being a hotbed of corruption and more importantly, drug trafficking, particularly in terms of opium. You've seen these different groups finance themselves through the drug trade, whether it's the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, or Al-Qaeda. We also saw in recent years how ISIS enriched itself through all types of illicit activities, such as oil sales and human trafficking, the sale of antiquities, in order to set up and more importantly maintain what is their Islamic State, which has now been vanquished in the physical world. We're still battling with them in the virtual world. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, and Boko Haram in Nigeria are other examples of Islamic extremist groups that leverage crime in order to maintain themselves. And one of those crimes is actually money laundering. More in our region, we've actually seen very disturbing signs of an actual resurgence of the FARC dissidents in the last couple of weeks, and then the criminal gangs in Colombia. And then lastly, Hezbollah and its global facilitators. So just to show you a couple of examples, we've actually attacked the financing of ISIS in order to really go after what is the lifeblood for their existence. And that actually helped to crumble and more importantly, vanquish the Islamic State faster than people anticipated. And this is an example of how many different ways, as I mentioned earlier, they had actually financed themselves. Very diversified, not new crimes, but they became the richest terrorist group in the world in about 2014, exceeding the rank of the Colombian FARC. And we also have the case of Lebanese Hezbollah that leverages cocaine trafficking from South America into the Middle East and Europe by piggybacking on used car trade scenarios to move used cars bought with Hezbollah cash in the United States. And then the containers with these used cars would go into Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, and be also loaded with cocaine when they were transited across to Africa. The cars would be offloaded and sold in Africa, which is a legitimate business, but then the cocaine would go north into the more lucrative markets of Europe. So this is an example of how a case started with used cars, and then it was dual purposed by carrying Colombian cocaine. And then it was a case of money laundering through this Lebanese Canadian bank. And that became terrorist financing because in the Lebanese Canadian bank, some of the proceeds from this cocaine trafficking went into the bank accounts of known Hezbollah militants. So it's an example of true convergence of terrorism and crime, and a multi-year, multi-jurisdictional. We had about 12 countries that were involved in this investigation in order to dismantle this scheme that's known as the Lebanese Canadian Bank Scheme. But what's happening now is something that we need to focus on, and more importantly, be much more prescriptive and anticipate, is the impact of COVID-19. It's impacting every corner of the world and every sector in our society. So first, as you know and you have read, Latin America is quickly becoming the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the cases are actually multiplying faster than any other rates in other region in the world. So it just doesn't even have an impact just on the people, the population, but also in terms of what's happening with the stay-at-home or the quarantine policies, which are having a big effect on economic prosperity. As you know, with the lockdowns, you actually have zero movement of trade. And even more importantly, Latin America relies so much on the export of commodities as well as tourism. You're going to anticipate about a 5.6% drop in the GDP for Latin America in 2020. What you're also seeing is there's effects on democracy. There's allegations of people being deprived of their human rights and their freedom of physical movement because of the stay-at-home and the quarantine policies. And as you can imagine, it has a huge effect on public security, where the police, the military, and other civilian authorities are asked to do extra tasks and extra missions because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But how is it affecting money laundering and terrorist financing? Because of the borders that have been closed, you physically cannot move the cash. So in the past couple of weeks in the United States, my colleagues in Homeland Security have come across the largest stashes of cash across the United States because the traffickers have been unable to move that cash southbound from the United States to Mexico and further south to pay for and sustain the supply chain. And this is a very interesting question as to what's going to happen as we open back up, and more importantly, as the borders resume normal operation. As you've heard, the United States, we've actually extended with Canada and Mexico our closed border policy for the next several weeks. The other piece that's also being impacted, as I mentioned earlier, is trade-based money laundering. We'll just use as well the example of Mexico, where you would have actual trade-based money laundering of the export of avocados to the United States that are, let's say, valued at $1 each. And the trafficker in the United States who's trying to push that money down would send back $3 for every one avocado, which is an over-invoicing. Because you've actually had a stop in international trade, the trade-based money laundering is not working because of the physical problems of crossing the border. And what we're seeing now, what is happening is there's a move towards cryptocurrencies or the digital space in order to try to start to move not just the money, but also orders online for drugs. So they just had a meeting recently convening the actual Financial Action Task Force, which is based in Paris. And they took a look at what the risks are in terms of money laundering and terrorist financing in the age of the pandemic. So first of all, got to figure out how these groups are starting to take advantage of banks that don't have time to do a lot of the due diligence or the know your customer measures that they usually do. And then more importantly, how they're misusing online financial services to move, and then more importantly, to hide funds. We're also anticipating, because there's so much economic stimulus that has been put into the economy, that you're going to see a lot of problems in terms of fraud. And more importantly, the actual misuse and the diversion of foreign aid as well as internal aid. Just to give an example, in the United States, we've actually allocated $4 trillion of economic stimulus to the private sector and different parts of our US government, and somebody has to oversee it. So we're trying to take a look at, as I mentioned, the fact that the terrorists and criminals are really having a hard time to actually think about physically moving money the traditional way, but they're going to now take a look at different ways. And this is something that we're very worried about. They're going to be buying into distressed businesses who are going bankrupt as fronts for their activities, particularly those that are very intensive in terms of cash. So this could be restaurants, import-export, other types of tourism. Casinos is an area that we're very worried about. And so what are we supposed to do? So we have to actually think about how do we better stay alert as to what the implications and impact of the pandemic are going to have on our financial system. And then more importantly, educate the private sector as to the types of scams and frauds that could be perpetrated by criminal networks across the Americas. And then more importantly, we really need to start focusing more resources on the cyber realm. How are these groups using the internet? And then more importantly, how are they financing themselves through cryptocurrencies? And just to finish up, and many of you know I've written a lot on this topic, now more than ever, we have to really think about how it's a whole of nation approach. It's not just the public sector, the government, that's responsible for combating terrorism, crime, corruption, and then more importantly, the ancillary crimes of like money laundering and terrorist financing. But we have to elicit support from the private sector and the civic sector. We're seeing this quite positively, this collaboration across the sectors in the actual first line response to the pandemic, through all of the collaboration for therapies as well as vaccines. So we need to take and translate this whole of nation approach beyond just the scientific approach, but also into the realm of transnational organized crime, and particularly in the space of money laundering and terrorist financing. And with that, thanks so much for your attention. And let me get out of this. Great.
Selena, thank you much. Excellent presentation, really. I have one question, and perhaps you can answer it. I think mostly countries take seriously fight against terrorists, or in some cases with certain activity of organized crime, for example, drugs. But this component is lower in money laundering. What is your opinion, and what can be done with this? What's your perspective? Hello?
Let me unmute myself. Can you hear me now? Okay. So, it starts. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. So in the past, we've always looked at, people always thought that money laundering or financial crime or tax evasion was what they call a victimless crime, but that's actually not true. And we've actually learned to appreciate how important the financiers are. So as you know, I'm from the United States, where we have a legal framework where we actually on purpose now equate the acts of the financier as if they were actually a terrorist or and criminal. And that's where we've elevated the charges against the crime, as well as the time in prison for those who are the financiers. So each country has to take its own attitude and approach, but until it's made a serious crime at the level of human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, you're never going to have that kind of level of respect for the gravity of the crime. The other thing that's very helpful is we have something called an asset forfeiture law, where if you seize the assets of a criminal group or a terrorist group, you can take the assets and more importantly, reassign those assets to better use. And that's what the sanctions against Venezuela are intended to achieve once they have what we call day one, the day one after Maduro exits.
Okay. We have the last question, and we are going to ask the next speaker. Ricardo from Argentina asked if he has been detected any elite recruitment from China to use the pandemic to finance regional networks. I don't know if you understand the question, Selena.
Yeah. So we're very concerned about what China has been doing in the region, but even more so what they're trying to do now. We don't have any proven examples yet of that type of financing, but we suspect they're going to try to do that. So as you know, China is one of the greatest donors in terms of debt to Latin America for legitimate commercial purposes. But we are worried that they're going to use the economic recession that's going to hit all of our countries because of the pandemic in order to bargain and secure better relationships and coerce certain countries into whether it's a debt agreement or a cooperation agreement that would favor China. So it's something that we need to take a look at. And it's not just China. As we see in Venezuela, the activities of Iran and Russia and Lebanese Hezbollah, it's very important that we keep an eye on what we call the external actors in Latin America, because they might try to destabilize in this post-pandemic, chaotic, and desperate situation certain countries who may not be very well equipped in order to respond medically and economically to the post-pandemic.
Thank you so much. Another speaker sent me the last question, and we are going to pass the next speaker. He asked me if you have any advice or suggestions to the countries from South America. We are going to focus the next speakers, next dissertations in criminal organizations of South America. What suggestion, what advice can you give us to try to be more effective to try to fight money laundering in this region?
So most importantly, you all know that money has no color or flag or passport. So it moves across. What's very important now, and I've been speaking about this on the transnational organized crime front, but also on the money laundering part, it's so important that we countries take lessons learned and then best practices. When we start to see new techniques of, for example, using the remittances, right, the remesas, as a way to move things, it's so important that the neighboring countries also know, because it's a technique they're going to use well beyond one country. So this is actually where our international cooperation and webinars such as this one, where we're sharing experiences and then more importantly, observations that will help us inform how to design policies and strategies to combat all the different aspects of transnational organized crime in the region. We've done a lot of this recently, and I'm sure our speakers are going to talk about it in the counter-narcotics and the drug trafficking realm, but we need to expand that. And it's a very important opportunity now to share what's happening in one country is probably happening in another country as well. Thank you for all your questions, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Selena. Excellent dissertation. Thank you so much. Next speaker is Marcus Reis from Brazil. I'm going to tell you some information about Marcus. Marcus is a general coordinator and secretary of strategic issues in the President of Brazil Republic. He's a lawyer. He has a master in economy and a master in human rights. Marcus is graduated in Hemispheric Defense Study William Perry Center and in European Security Studies George Marshall Center. He is a specialist in counter transnational organized crime. Marcus, are you here? Can you hear me? Marcus? Hello? Marcus? If you like, you can start.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. If you want, start. Marcus? Marcus, if you have a technical problem, please tell me, and we are going to give the turn to the next speaker. Can you hear me? Okay. Gabriela Nava from Mexico. Can you hear me?
Yes, Fernando, here I am. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah. Okay. We are going to continue the presentation, the seminar with you. I'm going to give some information about you, and please be ready to continue. Gabriela Nava is from Mexico. She is criminologist. She is a national security intelligence analyst. She is two senior consultant political intelligence. She was analysis director in government institutions in the federal and state level in Mexico. Recently, she finished her designation as consultant of President of Ecuador for improved strategic intelligence center. Please, Gabriela, if you want, start your dissertation.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Alejandro, for this invitation, for having me here. We are going to talk about organized crime in Mexico. Let me share my screen. Just 1 second, please. Let me know if you can see a presentation, please. Hello?
Not yet, not yet.
I can see the presentation. Please put your. I think someone.
Give me a second.
Can you share your
yes, just here it is. Now can you see it?
Yeah, it's okay.
Perfect. Okay. As I was telling you, I am going to talk about organized crime in Mexico and the perspective in the coronavirus context. First of all, I want to tell you that to understand organized crime in Mexico, we must understand how it started and how it evolved. In the very beginning, there were only two important cartels, as you can see, around the 80s. We had the Guadalajara cartel and the Gulf cartel. Their criminal activities were production and trafficking of marijuana to the United States. From my point of view, since these cartels were trafficking abroad, they formed since the very beginning were transnational and organized. Then we have a second stage between last years of the 80s decade and 90s. Cartels started with cocaine trafficking and therefore made strategic alliances. Both cartels reached Colombian organizations as suppliers of cocaine. But the most important event during this decade, during these years, was the emergence of Amado Carrillo's organization, as you can see in here, and also Los Valencia, that is the predecessor of the Cartel of Jalisco Nueva Generación. The Juarez cartel established links with South American producers of cocaine and started a large-scale cocaine trafficking to Mexico as a point of entrance to the United States. In this time, violence between drug cartels were sporadic, related to personal disputes, instead territories or drug trafficking routes control, as I said, and their criminal activities were only drug production and trafficking. In this stage, we didn't have some other different crimes linked to these organizations. Now we're going to jump to the 2000 year. And well, let me tell you something before. Between 80s and 90s, the government on its part was successful in managing corruption as they established the rules of drug trafficking and held the control of citizen security. Government and organized crime cartels had a tacit agreement that was beneficial for both parts. Now, in the beginning of the 21st century, there are many more cartels, and here you can see the Valencia's organization. As I was telling you, they are today Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación. Its beginning and development is a very relevant case. As you know, now it's the most dangerous, the biggest problem in security issues in Mexico. Perhaps we could talk about the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, but in some other presentation. Well, as I was telling you, in this period, besides the emergence of more criminal groups, we observe the emergence of new drugs, such as methamphetamine. Naturally, the more groups, the more disputes. However, between 2000 and 2005, violence between drug cartels was an isolated security problem. From 2006 to 2012, we observed the emergence and disappearance of cartels, confrontations, strategic alliances, disputes over control of drug production, regions, micro-trafficking, and drug trafficking routes. Also, we start to observe new crimes linked to organized cartels. At the same time, federal Mexican government started to organize crime combat strategy, which eventually became another factor for the escalation of violence in Mexico. Even though the Mexican army participated in a very specific activities related to drug trafficking combat in Fox administration, in 2006, Mexican Army and Navy starts their participation in citizen security. Today, we have a very high criminal capacity since they have more money, more gunpowder, more people, and overall more acceptance between some sectors of Mexican society besides the political sector. Impunity, the lack of rule of law, and a deficient presence of the state have become criminal groups' strengths. Along with the evolution of organized crime, Mexican government has established security policies to control this security threat. As you can see in the recent years, we have a big problem. We cannot observe just one organization, but thousands of small groups. They are linked to high impact crimes such as kidnapping, human trafficking, extortion, fuel robbery. Currently, fuel robbery is one of the biggest threats to national security. As Selena was saying, money laundering is a big problem linked to these groups. And also the intelligence activities are more difficult because, as you can see, we have hundreds of small groups, and gather the intelligence and the information that is necessary to identify the correct strategy to combat this problem is daring. Today, they have a very high criminal capacity, as I was saying, since they have more money and more gunpowder. And the government is overpassed, I think. Now, along with the evolution of organized crime, Mexican government has established security policies to control the security threat. Between 80s and 90s, the strategy was a tacit pact between federal government and drug cartels to keep violence on very low rates and to send all the drugs to the United States. Nothing must remain in Mexico. But in 2000, Mexican government faces an increase in crimes such as kidnapping and robbery. The president, Vicente Fox, inherited the federal police that was made up of 3rd Brigade of Military Police, intelligence officers from the Center for Investigation and National Security, and federal police force focused on federal highway security. In this period, Mexican Army and Navy did not participate either combat of drug cartels or citizen security function. As I was telling you, the responsibility of citizen security was the federal police, and the crimes they had to fight was kidnapping and robbery, and some issues related with natural disasters. In this moment, the rates of violence were low, and folks didn't use the armed force in security functions. But in 2006, Felipe Calderón started its government with a security strategy focused on direct combat of organized crime through policial strategy. Even though the government had the federal police, it was insufficient, and the strategy incorporated Mexican Army and Navy on specific tasks against organized crime in the first stage. The federal government sent resources to the states to build or rebuild local police institutions, but the Mexican states failed. Drug cartels consolidate their influence in local police through corruption, and police officers protected criminal groups, allowing the expansion of their control along the country. Armed forces had to take over citizen security as well as organized crime combat. The federal government was practically dependent on the armed force to guarantee citizen security. Federal police never became a resistant institution. Instead, it had severe problems of corruption. Now, in 2012, the strategy remained exactly the same as Felipe Calderón's strategy, but included a very important component, social crime prevention. The goal was controlling violence through social development by identifying regions where social issues such as multidimensional poverty, social violence, or unemployment were criminal factors. In paper, the strategy had high possibilities of success, but its implementation was deficient and surrounded by corruption and political issues and biases. At the end of Peña's government, violence was in its most critical moment. Homicide rates were the highest in years, and an efficient justice system assuring impunity for organized crime and high-impact crimes. As I was telling you, high-impact crimes like kidnapping, extortion, fuel robbery, human trafficking, prostitution, etc. Now, in 2018, López Obrador became finally president under the promise of finish the criminal violence and return the soldiers to their quarters. As you will know, it did not happen. And on the contrary, López Obrador created the National Guard, and recently he has ordered the armed forces to remain on the streets, accomplishing citizen security functions. Armed forces have almost 20 years of experience in citizen security, whether they wanted to be on this function or not. And they have learned from their mistakes. The relationship between the Mexican army and civil population is not at its best moment, since President López Obrador, at the very beginning, today is a different speech, but the very beginning of his administration, he stated a rejected speech against armed forces during his presidential campaign. But in the end, he has to use them again, and the same way his predecessors did. Now, what is going to happen with organized crime in Mexico? A few weeks ago, I wrote an article about social basis of organized crime. To me, this is the most relevant threat that Mexican government must face. The social acceptance and normalization of criminal behavior makes certain social protection of the criminal groups. And this situation is linked to the lack of presence of the state in some regions of Mexico. Security is now guaranteed by organized crime instead of the state. We have a general view about this situation, but currently we don't know the specific causes of this social phenomenon. In my opinion, President López Obrador would seek a tacit agreement with the organized crime, like the one federal government had on the past century. I do not believe that this would be a successful strategy, since the drug cartels are completely different from the cartels of the last century. Today, we are not talking about two organized groups, but perhaps of hundreds of them. Their activities are more complex and violent than drug trafficking, and they have taken spaces that must be regulated and controlled by the government. Also, we have a very interesting problem with organized crime, that is that they are developing an ideology, a moral base that is very influent in the Mexican population. They are normalizing criminal behavior. They are accepting their criminal behavior. And also some regions, the population is seeing organized crime as the real authority instead the state. I believe that these gaps are going to be taken by the organized crime, and returning to a social and political security is going to be harder and harder. Finally, I believe that security in Mexico will be worse before it gets better, and civil population will suffer the consequences along the economy and political development of the country. Mexican organized crime will remain as a new hemispheric security threat. Therefore, international cooperation will be necessary in order to guarantee the hemispheric secure and perhaps international secure. And that would be all, Fernando.
Perfect, Gabi. Perfect. I have a question for you. The Mexican case is a reference case for countries in South America. We see Mexican case and we afraid for the high rates of deaths, high violence, big cartels, corruption networks. What lesson could we learn from Mexico, from our countries? What do you think we should learn from Mexico? What is your perspective about this?
I think that we must understand that organized crime cannot be fought just through armed force actions or police actions, but we need to understand what is happening in the social context. And we need to understand also that if we do not understand the causes of organized crime from a social point of view, we are going to fight a monster that is growing every day. I think that we must think out of the box in order to find the best strategy to manage organized crime. I believe that it's going to be hard to finish them for good, but we need to learn how to manage this security threat.
Okay. One question that made me another someone in the audience. He asked me, what is your perspective about the actual president? How is doing things, López Obrador? How is the policy that he implements?
Well, first of all, I have to say that President López Obrador is like a new kind of leadership. He doesn't think about security in strategic terms or in national security terms or in intelligence terms. He thinks about security more, as I was saying, as a social issue related to poverty and unemployment and difference between economy situations and issues like that. Today is not clear what exactly he wants to do about organized crime and insecurity in Mexico. The only thing that is absolutely clear is that he is going to continue using the armed force in citizen security functions and nothing more. We cannot see if he is going to redo or rethink the criminal justice system in Mexico, that is one of the weakest part of the justice system in Mexico. We cannot see if he is going to rebuild a civil force like the federal police, or if he's going to support the strengthening of local police institutions in the states and municipalities. So it's hard to say what is going to happen with this strategy. As I was saying, I think that before the security scenario is going to be better, I think that it's going to be worse in the I don't know, next year, maybe 2 next year.
Okay. Gaby, again, congratulations. Thank you so much. And we are going to continue with the next speaker. With the next speaker, I'm going to put the slides. I expect to can do that. And I introduced before, he is Marcus Vinicius Reis. He is from Brazil. He is a General Coordinator and Secretary of Strategic Issues in Presidents of Brazil Republic. He is a lawyer, a master in economy. He has a master in human rights. And Marcus, too, is graduated in Hemispheric Defense Studies, William Perry, and in European Security Studies, George Marshall Center. He is as a specialist in counter transnational organized crime. Let me try to put the presentation, Marcus, and we are going to to start. So one moment. Let me try share your screen. Okay. Can you see your the presentation?
No.
Hello? No? Okay. Let me see. I'm going to send to the other to Alejandro. Let me try it. If you want, give me the introduction, and we are going to start with the presentation. Marcos, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Fernando. I would like to thank the Revista Digital Seguridade Defense for another opportunity and to be at this conference. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with my friends from other seminars and courses, especially the Paris Center family. Thank you very much. I'm gonna turn off my image here. I'm gonna talk about the three major criminal organizations in Brazil, which are the Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, if you translate to something like First Capital Commander, the Comando Vermelho, or Red Commander, and the Família do Norte, Family of the North. It's important to mention that in Brazil we have approximately 37 criminal organizations, but all of these are affiliated in some way with the three previously mentioned organizations. So despite a lot of criminal organizations in Brazil, all of them are linked to one of these three major organizations. Great, Fernando.
Now you can see?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can go to the next slide.
Okay. Go to the next. How can do that? Ready?
Yeah. So the PCC, Primeiro Comando da Capital, it's the largest Brazilian criminal group today. They have more than 10,000 members. Its origin was in 1990s in the Tabata prison in São Paulo. Its organization has changed a lot since the rise of the leader Marco Antônio Camacho, Marcola, who brought ideology into the group, which attract the attention of prisoners and their families. The main cause of this group is the defense of the rights of prisoners and their families. The PCC uses this ideology to recruit members of other criminal organizations who want to belong to this group. They are right now a famous brand among Brazilian prisoners, like Nike and Amazon and Apple. It's a brand here. The PCC is already a brand, and with everyone waiting to belong to this group. So there is no competition in the market for the price of drugs and weapons in Brazil right now, because they control everybody. So they created a monopoly, preventing the emergence of competitors. PCC is spread through the Brazilian territory in at least 23 states. And besides, we already know that they are active in countries of the region, like Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Peru, and Colombia too. The second group, Comando Vermelho, is the oldest Brazilian criminal organization. It appeared in the 1970s in Rio de Janeiro at Ilha Grande prison. Brazilian political prisoners, largely with leftist ideology and trained by former foreign and communist governments like the ex-Soviet Union, were placed together with ordinary prisoners, passing on tactics and combat strategies.
Next.
And finally, the Família do Norte. It's a group that emerged in the state of Amazonas, the north of the country, to combat the advance of PCC in this state. This group joined with the Comando Vermelho at the beginning, eliminating almost all members of PCC from prisons in Amazon. They killed more than 100 prisoners that was from PCC since between 2016 and 2019. And Família do Norte, they want to control the drug corridor between Colombia, Peru, and the Brazilian Atlantic. Yes, if you can see this map, we can see, all the states of Brazil, we have 27 states here in Brazil. All the states, we have some criminal organization. These 3 organizations, they are spread around the country. And if you see, there are 2 places in Brazil that they want to go. The center of Brazil, the center to the south of Brazil, close to São Paulo, because the port of Santos, and the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco and Rio Grande do Norte, because of the port of Suape in Pernambuco and the port of Natal. So they can bring the drug from Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia and send the drug to Africa and Europe using these corridors. The next, Fernando. Yes. So if you, if you see this map, you can see the location of 2 places in Brazil, well located. So we can better see the privileged position of the northeast region and the port of Santos in São Paulo. So these 2 places are the places that we take the drug to Africa and Europe. On the Africa continent, Moroccan traffickers from Morocco help bring the drug to Europe and Asia. In Europe, the Italian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, is the main partner for the sale of cocaine. The Italian mafia lately has been working exclusively with the Brazilian PCC. Now we can see a partnership, a huge partnership between 'Ndrangheta and PCC. The next, Fernando. No, one before. Yeah. So we can see the interest of this organization in the northeast states of Brazil, which takes the drug from Colombia, Bolivia, Peru to the port of Suape in Pernambuco and the port of Natal, Rio Grande do Norte. There also seems to be a new interest in the central region of Brazil, which may be a direct route from Bolivian cocaine to northeast ports. And finally, it also appears to be starting a great interest in going out to the Pacific Ocean to take the drug directly to Asia. This is not a reality right now, but we are seeing some movements of these organizations, and they are trying to go to Peru and Ecuador, and maybe to carry the drug to Asia straightly, directly. Next. Yeah. So if you, this is a huge market for Brazilian criminal organizations, and why they are interested in this. The USA, they are not interested in going to USA because of Mexico and the Colombians, they are there. And the Brazilian criminal organization, they see a lot of problems dealing with the judicial system in USA. So they don't want USA. They want to go to Europe, Africa, and Asia. So maybe there is no interest in starting a war against the American government on the Mexican and Colombian cartels. I think so. And the gains from the European market may reach 9 billion euros. Right now, 20% of the drugs seized at the port of Antwerp in Belgium in 2019 was Brazilian. So they are going to Europe. They are not going to United States. They are going to Europe and Africa and Asia. The next one. Now what matters? And now the next, Fernando. Yeah. What could happen from now on? What are the strategic possibilities of large Brazilian criminal organizations? Colombia could be an alternative. Fronts 1 and 16 of the FARC are in peace process, demobilizing themselves, which would leave a legacy that could be used by Brazilian criminal organizations. Fronts 1 and 16 are located close to the Brazilian border, next to the state of Amazonas, and would pass through northern Brazil to the port of Suape and Natal. And Brazilian criminal organizations would gain even more if they controlled the cocaine market, from production to injection in African and European territories. It's believed that this process was started but left behind. Between 2016 and 2018, several massacres occurred in prisons in Amazon, with hundreds of deaths of PCC, FDN, and CV members. So right now we have a little bit. We are sure that they left behind this idea to go to Colombia. There's another possibilities from them.
Okay.
Yeah, next, Fernando. And why possibilities? The Peruvian territory. Without proximity to the United States, the Brazilian criminal organization, they see Colombia too close to the United States and they don't want to go there. So Peru maybe is the next step. Without proximity to US government and with the exit to the Pacific Ocean, it may be the path to Asia that Brazilian criminal organizations want. In addition to being able to bring the drug across the north of Brazil on traditional routes via the port of Santos and Suape. It's important to know that the corridor in center or south of Brazil has already been conquered by PCC with the dominance of Paraguayan territory, especially after the murder of drug dealer Jorge Rafa in 2016, who also supplied drugs to the Comando Vermelho. So this route brings cocaine from Bolivia and marijuana from Paraguay via Paraguayan territory and the central part of Brazil to the port of Santos. So from this port, the drug goes to Africa and Europe. The Comando Vermelho and Família do Norte are left with the northern route and the possible new Pacific route, which can be explored by all Brazilian groups. So they are looking for another path, another route, maybe from Peru to Asia or from Ecuador to Asia. They are not going to Colombia. The next one, Fernando. So as we can see, we have two routes for the drug here in Brazil. The blue, dominated by PCC, brings the drug from Bolivia to Port of Santos, and then to Africa and Europe. The second one, the red, dominated by Comando Vermelho and Família do Norte, brings the drug from Colombia and Peru to Port of Suape and Natal, and then to Africa and Europe too. And the green route is another possibility to be explored by Brazilian criminal organizations. They could send the drugs from Peru to Asia without any European and African group helping. More money for them. Next. So what can we expect? So what lies ahead? Well, we can think some possibilities for strategic movement of Brazilian criminal organizations, such as maybe reducing the violence of conflicts with the Brazilian police, maintaining a low profile. It would be a case of a union between organizations on the northeast route of Brazil. Maybe a greater expansion to Europe, African and Asian markets. More intense use of ideology to reduce internal political opposition, as well as to prevent new organizations from appearing and competing in their markets, so they can maintain the price of the drug in the country. Fourth, association with Mexican cartels, especially the cartel of the Nueva Generación de Jalisco, for the introduction in the southeast and the south, the richer regions of Brazil. They are looking for to bring the methamphetamines to these regions in Brazil. As a matter of fact, we have already arrested people from the cartel of Nueva Generación in the state of Santa Catarina in the south of Brazil. Maybe the fifth, diversify, selling not only drugs and weapons, but biodiversity. Biodiversity is there's a huge market for biodiversity right now. Biodiversity, people, and cyber crimes. Right now we see, because of the COVID-19, a lot of new kinds of cyber crimes emerging in our society. And here in Brazil, there's an increasing of 30% of this kind of crimes here. And right now we are seeing some links with PCC, especially PCC. They are trying to commit or committing this kind of crimes. Venezuela is a huge problem right now. Many possibilities, because we have a narco state and a failed state. So a lot of possibilities for the criminal organizations, the Brazilian criminal organizations, to go to that state and to make some associations. We don't know right now. And the seventh, the post-COVID-19, new ideas, new technology and methods of action. As I said, cybercrime came as a source of income for these organizations. They are earning a lot of money because of cybercrimes right now. And next one. Next, Fernando. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Congratulations, Marcus. Very good presentation. I would like to ask you, you in the last slide, you mentioned post-COVID new ideas and new technologies. How can impact these new ideas and new technology in organized crime? What is your idea in respect?
Because they are using the same technologies that we are using right now. They at home, they are using new ways to communicate, to send drugs, to send weapons, maybe the deep web. And right now we can see here in Brazil more than 30% of increasing in this kind of crimes here in our society, and a lot of them related to PCC right now. So they are earning money from this kind of crime here in Brazil, using this kind of technology. hacking.
Good. I think there's no any questions. If let me see here. One someone asked me, how is the situation now in Brazil? How is the situation regard to Brazil in at this time? Criminal organizations are more comfortable or they are in retirement? What's your opinion about this?
The organized crime now, they are in a low profile right now. They're not appearing very much. There's not too much confusion with the police right now, as we saw last year. Last year we had a lot of conflicts between the organized crime, especially PCC and Comando Vermelho, and the police force here in Brazil. But this year, no, because of the virus.
Okay. Someone in Argentina asked, Marcelo from Argentina asked, if you have knowledge, if are there, if is there any connection between PCC and Argentina? Do you know something about the situation?
Yes, we know that PCC has entered in Argentina a lot of times, maybe in small cities close to the border of Brazil, robbing banks, and maybe they are going to Argentina and to see if they can feel comfortable there to initiate or to begin some actions. We don't know yet. But Argentina is a market for PCC. Argentina is not too strategic. Maybe it's a market because they can sell the drugs in Argentina.
Good.
They can bring the drug from Bolivia and sell the cocaine in Argentina.
Good. Marcos, congratulations, really, and thank you very much for your nice presentation. We are going to continue with the next speaker. He is from Colombia. He is Luis Asa from Colombia. I'm going to give some information about this. He is a Colombian Air Force officer. He is an specialist in human and humanitarian rights. He has a master in national security and defense. Luis is graduated in European Security Studies, Short Marshall, and he has a very important function. He was the government representative in peace process in Colombia. Please, Luis, if you want to, you can start.
Okay. You hear me, Fernando?
Yeah, I can hear you. And if you want to share, you can share your stage.
Okay. Alejandro, thank you very much for the opportunity today, for the space to talk about drug trafficking in Colombia and the transformation of the organized crime. Fernando, thank you very much for the space that you have given me in the agenda today. Before starting my speech, I congratulate today's exhibitors, Professor Solina. Very interesting information about the money trail to combat terrorism and corruption in the age of COVID-19. Thank you, Marcus, for the information from Brazil, who has the dynamics organized crime being in the south of Colombia, border with Brazil. Gabriela, your information was very interesting, related to the connection of the cartels of Mexico with organized crime in Colombia, and to be able to know the first hand to interference they have in Central America up to Colombia. Thank you to all of you of participating in the webinar today. Excuse me a second and take the presentation. Fernando, you see a presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Excuse me.
Perfect. See, we
Okay.
can see.
First, background. Today I'm talk to metamorphosis of the drug cartels of Colombia. I am Lieutenant Colonel retired, Luis Fernando de Asa Rosso. And my agenda today, background, illegal commercialization, organized crime connection, means of transport, and conclusions. Background. The North drug trafficking cartels were the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel. Initially, between the 18 and 19 decades, they began trafficking marijuana, and next found in Peru and Bolivia some groups which had a business of cocaine. So he begins to make transactions with these groups, and he made coordination to send to Central America. And the marijuana begins to move the second business, and the demand for cocaine begins to increase in Central America and the United States. Then he creates a complex that he called Tranquilandia, where he cultivated and processed the cocaine and then take into Antioquia, Medellin, and from there distribute to Central America and the United States. And next, in 1982, the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel appears. The Medellin cartel may be Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa's brother, Gustavo Gaviria, and Carlos Leder. The interference in northwest of Antioquia, and the other cartel was Cali cartel, the Orejuelas brothers, Jose Santa Cruz, and Pacho Herrera. This cartel has interference in southwest and south of Colombia. In the president to vice period from 1978 to 1982, three important events happened. First, the extradition treaty with President Jimmy Carter in 1979. In his campaign against drug trafficking, proposed to Colombia state to make an agreement to extradite drugs lords to the United States. As a result of this event, pressure from the cartels toward the Colombian government begins to emerge to prevent the treaty from finally began signing for terrorist attacks, car bombs, threat to personalities in the country, and whatever. The second event was the relationship between the cocaine cartels and the guerrillas. And this time, the M19 group begins to have agreement with Cali cartel and coordinates so that M19 kidnaps Marta Ochoa, the brothers of Ochoa's sister of the Cali cartel, of the Medellin cartel, excuse me. And the FARC began its ideological change, began to mix its ideology with the cocaine business. It begins to build to the cocaine cartel in the sector, where they had their laboratories, and for each kilo of cocaine produced, they had to give a percentage to the FARC. This was in the Tuber presidency, and after in 1982, in the President Turbay period, proposed a tax reform in which was planned to legalize money from drug trafficking and also give social participation to the members of the cartels. As a result of the proposal reform, Pablo Escobar created his political group called Civis Movement, and Carlos Leder created a national Latin movement. Next, in 1984, the military forces find Tranquilandia in the south of Colombia, and after a military operation destroyed this complex. It was a large tract of coca cultivated and laboratories with all the infrastructure for its processing. We are talking about construction with the capacity to work 24 hours to cocaine orders for Mexico, United States, and Europe. But Pablo Escobar generated more routes to take cocaine from Colombia to Central America. He begins to have direct contact with the leaders of the Mexican cartels and the connection with groups in Central American countries. Then came the murder of the Minister of Justice Guillermo Lara Bonilla by the Medellin cartel gangster. Then, during Barco presidency between 1986 and 1990, there were events that began to destroy the Medellin and Cali cartels. The first, in 1987, was the capture of Carlos Leder by DEA and his extradition. As a result of this event, Pablo Escobar made an alliance with the other members of the Medellin cartel, and openly to the public opinion, they called it the extraditables. In 1988, they made a letter of the government of Colombia and the Colombian people declaring a total war. In this time, the Medellin cartel had 3,000 gangsters, and Pablo Escobar paid to murder police 1 million pesos for each agent, 2 million pesos for each non-commissioned officer, and 3 million pesos for each officer. Another important event that time was to propose the submission law in order to give the opportunity for the members of the cartels to surrender and obtain benefits and reduction in the penalties. With that law, the members of the Cali cartel began to surrender, and utilization of the principal gangster, the Orejuelas brothers. Due to those captures, the Cali cartel practically disappeared, and the Medellin cartel took control of all routes of cocaine. And in 1990, the Medellin cartel managed 95% of the cocaine to send from Colombia to Central America, Mexico, and the United States. In 1991, the President Gaviria approved legislation to prohibit extradition with two purposes. First, lower the pressure of the cartels of the government, and the second, start approaching the cartel to propose a demobilization, peaceful and voluntary. That was how Pablo Escobar surrendered in 1991, and in common agreement with the government, he was recluded in the Cathedral Jail in Medellin. But at the next year, in 1992, he escaped from this prison. Finally, in 1993, he was killed by the search block and ended the cartel's time. Then comes the second phases of the metamorphosis with the demobilization process of the AAUC in 2006 and the peace process with the FARC in 2017. First, that was how 13,600 carried out the mobilization process and leaving dissident about 4,000 members of this and joined the other armed groups that were in that time. In 2012, the Gulf Clan and the Rastrojos group began to emerge with part of the dissident of the process with the AUC, beginning to have influence on the borders with Venezuela and Panama. They began to acquire long and medium-range weapons on the black market and the Sinaloa's cartel. For this reason, in 2016, the Defense of Minister ordered Directive 16. This directive empowered the military to combat organized armed groups, including air operations to attack the camps of this group. Later, in 2017, came the peace process of the FARC, and as a result, 13,000 FARC members handed over the weapons, but whoever 2,000 members didn't agree with the process. They become dissidents and continue to commit crimes as FARC dissidents. As a consequence, in 2017, the Defense of Minister approved the Directive 17. And this directive empowered the military forces to fight this group and additionally classify the illegal groups in three types. Type A, with influence in different departments of Colombia. Type B, with influence in a specific area of Colombia. And type C, groups that were locally operated, dedicated to work as mercenaries and micro-traffic. Regarding the illegal commercialization of cocaine to produce to alkaloid and sent to Central America, these criminal groups have three elements. First is the processing of cocaine. Second is to establish routes. And third is the armed component that provides security, both to clandestine laboratories and to the routes to guarantee your departure from other countries. This armed component is made up of the dissident of the two peace process, which had been working for a long time with the illegal business and had contact in Central America, Mexico, and United States, which according to a 2019 Ministry of Defense report, in Colombia are 30 groups with more than 10,000 members. So you look to the right as the route have been established for South America to Central America, Mexico, and United States. The value of cocaine kilogram in Colombia value around $1,800. The same kilogram in Central America valued in $2,500. In Mexico reaches the cost, the value $13,000, and United States can be valued maybe $30,000 per kilo of cocaine. In the cocaine production, this group used indigenous people and farmers to grow coca. These people have special legislation for the protection of human rights, and for this reason, these criminal groups advantage the situation because it's more difficult for the eradication operation police. This is the map of the indigenous protection areas in green and ochre color. And this is the map of the presence of coca crops. The left see a clandestine laboratories in south of Colombia, an armed group that provides security and has all the necessary infrastructure for its processing. In addition to this, it is located in an indigenous protected area. As has been the connection of these groups with organized crime, there are some routes that since the time the cartels, as I mentioned, has been developing until today, such as land, air, and sea routes, where not only they traffic with coca, but there is also evidence of an exchange of weapons. 2 years ago, and the end of 2018, on the border of Colombia with Ecuador, alias Huacho, kidnaps 3 Ecuadorian journalists and then killed them. As a result of these events, a whole military operation comes to his capture. And the end of 2018, he was neutralized for the military forces. And the investigation under the prosecutor Martinez found evidence of his direct connection to the Sinaloa cartel and the routes they were driving from Tumaco to Central America and Mexico. Tumaco is a seaport located in the southwest of Colombia on the Pacific Ocean, from which cocaine deliveries were made in 4 go fast to Central America or in submarines. These submarines was a capacity to transport 8,000 kilograms to cocaine to Mexico or United States. But they also had air routes using low performance planes or helicopters to flying over the coast at low altitude so as not be detected by radars and with the ability to land on the beach on runways. Other modality is the called drug trafficking mules. These illegal groups are looking for people with terminal health, economic problems, or death threats, and propose transport cocaine in his body in capsules. Finally, my conclusions. The first, we must break with the legal paradigms. It's true that the countries are respectful of the country's sovereign on the border, and we must carry out mutual practice to prosecute organized crime in the border areas. Since our threat in really is not with the neighbor, but with the drug trafficking and organized crime networks. Second, We must change the laws that limit the use of force by the military and police forces. For example, Costa Rica, there is a law that limits the police to use weapons greater than 7.6 caliber. So when a confrontation between the police and organized crime groups that possess sophisticated weapons of long or medium range, and the police are at disadvantage, it's important to check the regulation and modify them if necessary when the threat requires it. I mention this example because in this country, some groups have connection with organized crime. Third, advance in operational agreement with other countries in order to combat criminal gangs. For example, in Colombia, between 2000 and 2010 decades, Colombia had the problem of drug trafficking on air routes in left of Colombia in the east, from Caribbean to Central America. In this event, the Air Force complied with the established protocols for interception, but it was persecute only the sovereign limit of the Central America countries. But as a result of an operational agreement and good offices with the government of some Central America countries, then special protocols were allowed intercepting and following illegal planes to Central America. This strategy managed to reduce illegal flights on the Caribbean routes. Finally, it's important to propose new strategy based on hitting the centers of gravity of organized crime groups. It's important to make use of good intelligence and specialized monitoring to identify what is the real gravity center. As usual in the military operation is to chase the main leaders of this group who demand the development of military operations that require large budgets, months of planning, and even years of follow-up. And when captured or neutralized, the next day there is another boss of the heat of his group. So, what's the end result? Where is all the operational effort? If finally the problem continues, then it's necessary to able to identify the real gravity center, which is the really weakened term than say it's essential to study the different groups that make up organized crime networks and identify their individual center of gravity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Luis, congratulations. Thanks for your nice presentation. I was interested in the last point you say that it's necessary to new strategies based on hitting the gravity center of organized crime. I think it's the most important for a strategy to against organized crime. What idea do you have about these new strategies? What do you think? What should be done?
Please repeat the information. I don't hear you.
Okay. In your last slide, you mentioned in the last point the necessity that you need new strategies based on hitting the gravity centers of organized crime. right now you have in your stage.
Okay.
What is your idea? What should be done in about this?
Okay. Usually in the military operations, the military forces find a leader or the head of the groups. But maybe in the special case, it doesn't matter because the next day this group have the other hit, the other boss. Maybe it's possible study the other strategy. For example, um, for example, study the roots or the roots of organized crime, the roots of cocaine, and the principal point. It doesn't have the hit of the group. The principal point change. The principal point maybe it's a route, or maybe it's a in international bank account for this group. Maybe the groups it works are different, and it's important to study what is the real gravity center of the group.
Good, good. I'm going to make you the last question, and we are going to pass next speaker. Then, Marcus from Brazil asked, "What is the major problem caused by COVID-19 for the peace process?" Do you understand the question?
The problem for the process of the FARC or the AUC?
Both.
Okay, okay, okay. In my opinion, the principal problem with the peace process were in the different phases of the process of the peace process. The military forces doesn't have the real information of the members group. Maybe in this in this peace process, the government make a special office. In Colombia, it's the peace process direct, and he is the principal person, and the real he has a real number of the members, okay. But the military forces, it doesn't have this information. When the peace process ended, for this reason, was a high members dissident for this process.
Good. Thank you so much for your dissertation. And we are going to introduce the that is Alfonso Aragon Camarera. Alfonso is a specialist in international security. He has a master in international politics in McLaurin Institute of International Studies. Alfonso is graduated in Hemispheric Defense Studies, William Perry, and he is a PhD candidate International Relations and professor in National Autonomous University of Mexico. Alfonso, are you ready to continue?
I'm ready, Fernando. Thank you
Hi,
very
Alfonso.
much.
Good. You should take out your stage to let Alfonso put the slides. I don't know if Alfonso is going to use the slides, but you should take out. Luis? Luis should take out your slide,
Okay. Excuse me.
La pantalla. Sorry. Alfonso, when you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready, Fernando. Give me just a second for sharing the presentation.
Good. We can see it.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Fernando. Before sharing my thoughts about the state being under siege by transnational organized crime, I would like to thank you, Fernando, and Alejandro Perugorria from the Defense Security magazine in Argentina for the design and organization of this very interesting webinar. It has been immensely useful to listen the interesting analysis made by friends and professors, Selena, Marcus, Gabriela, and Luis Fernando, regarding specific features of organized crime and their scope and perspectives. In this brief minutes that I've been given, I will share some ideas and thoughts regarding the impact of TOC activities and strategic consequences within states that can actually facilitate its permanence and thriving. Now, with that in mind, I will just get started. Since the end of the 20th century, transnational organized crime has positioned itself as one of the most dangerous phenomena for societies and states on a global scale. Why is this? Because it has an increasing capacity to hinder development efforts, erode the rule of law, and create antisocial values. And that's why it has proven to be significant in nowadays democracies. Corruption spreading, massive killing, and economical profits have been the trademark or signature of this very particular phenomenon. Now, considering its strategic impact in human welfare, as we all remember, the Millennium Development Goals in 2000 addressed the need to step up the fight against transnational crime in all its dimensions. The degree of threat that it represented led international society to develop a global legal architecture capable of dealing with it. And that's how we came to construct, as international society, diverse treaties and conventions regarding organized crime, like the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and the protocols thereto. That was 2000. The protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially the cases of women and children. The protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. And the protocol against the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms, their parts, components, and ammunition. Last but not least, we have the United Nations Convention Against Corruption in 2003, among other international efforts. Now, we have unprecedented economical, legal, and technological cooperation that has been developed in the past decades to both deter and neutralize the threat that transnational organized crime poses to world security. However, this statement implies an important paradox. International society has never been more integrated and experienced such deep levels of bonding, both structurally and legally speaking in history. And despite well-known successes around the world, the enormous amount of available information regarding the groups, intelligence sharing, and collective repudiation, the phenomenon continues to grow, claiming lives in origin, transit, and destination countries, and generating economical, social, and political instability globally. The resilience of these groups has proven to be a most formidable obstacle to surpass, considering the efforts aforementioned. At the dawn of the 21st century, diverse analysts portrayed the features of state efforts towards organized crime, as well as their vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Moises Naim, for example, stated at that point in time that the illegal trade in drugs, arms, intellectual property, people, and money was blooming. Like the war on terrorism, the fight to control those illicit markets pitted governments against very agile, stateless, and resourceful networks empowered by globalization. This interesting description portrays organizations with valuable information assets, high levels of specialization, very fluid communication, and strong market analysis, but also a very high and efficient capacity to adapt to various and hostile environments. Just having in mind what Professor Salina mentioned a few minutes ago regarding the coronavirus pandemic, we can actually witness the strength of these organizations by assessing their activities during this particular health emergency. The fact is that they haven't stopped, but rather changed or shifted according to very specific contexts around the world. We can also trace other moments within the 21st century when their abilities to survive and adapt were put to the test. And times in which, for example, the global economy was not in its best, made organizations commit to other criminal activities, even if those were not part of their current specialization. So we witnessed, sadly to say, groups adding blackmail, extortion, drug or human smuggling to their previous illegal efforts. Now, if these organizations have demonstrated both resilience and flexibility, are there specific conditions and contexts for them to grow and accelerate their efficiency? The core question would be, which conditions would be ideal for transnational organized crime to prosper? And of course, there are many possible reasons, but I would like to focus specifically in this four. The first one is a weak rule of law. The second one can be considered a byproduct, depending on how we analyze it, which is having high levels of corruption. The third one would be the mistrust between societies and governments. And the fourth, societies with a lack of social mobility. But all of this is not going to matter a lot if we don't have impunity as the result. Now, even if groups can affect electoral processes and local politics around the world, governing is not in the agenda. Actually, governing is bad business. However, it is important to say gaining partners that are embedded in the de facto powers has proven to be a very, very solid strategy. Criminal groups benefit from a weakened judicial and political rule. Let's have as an example what would happen if there were no institutions to cooperate or negotiate with in order to make business. The scenario of operating, as an example, in a lawless territory could be counterproductive due to the investments needed to create a business-like environment. Transnational organized crime doesn't necessarily find its only impulse in less benefited people economically and socially speaking. We've been witnessing that for decades. TOC wouldn't be able to thrive if legal and security conditions were not guaranteed as an ideal theater of operations. Now, the creation of this so-called environment needs to be sustained by corruption. Corruption, as understood as the misuse of office for personal gain, can also mean charging an illicit price for a service or using the power of office to further illicit aims. It's actually considered to be a tool, a means to an end, not an end by itself. That reminds me, specialists like Shelley, Piccarelli, and Corpora, people that addressed the issue somewhere between 2002 and 2003, and they stated that organized crime provided electoral support and intimidation powers to politicians in return for protection and legitimation of their activities. And then, likewise, organized crime can provide protection and assistance with cartels in return for money. Hence, well, corruption is a key factor to consider when we analyze the behavior of international criminal organizations. However, and I think this is a core point in our analysis, it must be pointed out that if corruption does not lead to impunity, the setting for illegal business cannot be developed. As important as it can be, impunity has displaced corruption as one of the social, economical, and political chronicle disorders of the 21st century. And that is one of the biggest aims of transnational organized crime today. We already know that impunity can pave the way to very complex processes such as the state capture. Impunity, we also know it as a byproduct of corruption or a single product by itself, and consider it to be one of the cornerstones of criminal activities. We know by sad experience around the world that its presence undermines states' activities, allegiances, and future. And when I mention allegiances, it's not only in the outside, but in the inside. Now, how can we conceptualize state capture? It can be seen as the illegitimate influence that corporations, that can be illegal or illegal, exercise over national and international public institutions, manipulating them to act in accordance with their priorities at the expense of the public interest and the integrity of the systems necessary to respect, protect, and realize human rights and protect the environment. But we can also explain it, strategically speaking, as a transformation of public spaces into private ones, in which society's interest and welfare is no longer the core of its function. This can have a lot of consequences, but the expected ones can range actually from reduced income by states, of course, increasing social and economical inequalities. But those consequences can go to the erosion of the democratic construction of political institutions. Now, if impunity can be achieved, then capturing state institutions will be maintained as the most solid strategy to follow in the coming decades by transnational organized crime. Tactical and firepower strength, along with the threat of violence, will never be ruled out as options because they are part of the features of transnational organized crime, but they will not be considered to be more efficient than the latter. We already know that within time, and when organizations achieve certain level of maturity, the action of violence can actually also mean bad business. And we can see this in transnational organized crime groups that have been there for decades, if not centuries. For example, we can name the cases of the Italian mafias or the Japanese yakuza or the Chinese triads. These organizations learned within time that exercising violence for generating the markets could also be a hindrance to their own efforts for the pursuit of very specific benefits. And with this in mind, this line of thinking has led, for example, analysts like Douglas Farrar to consider this concept of narco-states as one of the imperative problems to be attended. I'm quoting him, while a failed state may have no real institutional structure to work with, weak state institutions provide the opportunity to co-opt security bodies, law enforcement officials, judicial officials, and of course, politicians whose authority can provide the most needed impunity. Now, the question of this few notes and thoughts that I'm sharing with you is, then why is the state under siege? We are already familiar with the very sad and shocking human and economical losses that are paramount in every way, but these are not necessarily the reasons why the state is under siege in the long run. Since the creation, states have always faced different risks and threats to their stability and existence. Some of them we know are capable to modify its population structure, for example, genocide, government policies and styles, and we have the case of guerrillas, and even replace it when it comes to war. But none of these has the ability to kidnap its very nature and reason of being without challenging its structure and maintaining it functional for very specific purposes. So, transnational organized crime, if not firmly faced, can actually transform a state and its government into an administrative branch for its operations, leaving the rest of society adrift. And I think that's one of the core components of the discussions that we will be having in the 21st century for trying to capitalize on what we know about the behavior of these specific organizations. We know at some point that society's perception lies at the bottom of the problem itself when we're talking about state capture, corruption, impunity. And I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to have some thoughts about the external frame of state when captured by transnational organized crime. The external frame can be represented by society's will, perception, and behavior. The internal frame are most of the times governmental activities and policies. Now, we have critical beliefs today that affect populations' will, again, perception and behavior. For example, one of these critical beliefs is that transnational organized crime will not disappear and cannot be defeated. Now, in order to analyze to a full extent this very specific issue, it's very relevant to understand which battles states have been losing in the external frame. The first of them, which is the one that I already mentioned, is that transnational organized crime will not disappear and cannot be defeated. If we go back in time, Italian mafias are still there, Japanese yakuza are still there, and Chinese triads are still there. They're not as violent as they could have been decades earlier, but they remain in the social tissue. Again, If social tissues around the globe continue to validate this particular statement, then the state capture is already underway. If society believes that crime organizations cannot be stopped or neutralized, despite the danger they pose to society, to government, and to the state in all its extent, then coexistence will be the only possible logical behavior. And that entitles a very dangerous path to walk. This implies that criminal organizations, will be standardized and consider factual powers with enough technological, economical capacities, and social support to shape society, and most importantly, to install values at its very core. This also implies that criminal organizations will meddle in the re-engineering process of the person, both as an individual and as a citizen, whose task should only be a state strategic attribution. Let me put it this way. If a state cannot determine and offer society the values that a citizen must have and uphold in order to accomplish its national interest, part of the battle for the future is already lost. When this stage is developing, then organized crime organizations are not only tolerated, but accepted, and in the worst case scenario, even praised. They stop being ethically punished by society and legally by governments due to corruption practices. Time has definitely changed societal views regarding crime. For example, let's take a look at what could have happened 40 years ago if a member of a family in whichever part of the world was part of a criminal effort. Most likely, families would react by isolating him and by ethically punishing him. And of course, they would be a legal punishment from the government. The standardization of organized crime eventually leads part of the society to consider them not only existing factual powers, but role models. That is also another very dangerous path to go with. Government is often portrayed as an enemy and as part of the problem at the same time. By having society alienated and faced from governments, organized crime organizations create the perfect breeding ground, not only for business, but also for growing and extending their activities. Now, the other part of society that does not sympathize with criminal efforts will be faced with enormous challenges. In a worst case scenario, may not be able to distinguish between government officials and criminal collaborators. With corruption practices that were considered to be injurious increasing exponentially and reaching society even in day-to-day affairs, the perception is that there is no state or rule at all. And if we take a look at this scenario and impunity reigns unchecked, then certain amount of citizens learn that the only way to survive might be playing the corruption dynamics and thus creating subcultures about it. And then we have points of no return. Because at this point, society battles itself, battles the government, leaving transnational organized crime out of the equation, when it should be the first thing to address. Now, with this thoughts in mind, then we see that transnational organized crime, for many people, is a normal feature in political, economical, and social state reality, which shouldn't be there. And of course, for some people, is nowadays a normal alternative for the construction of a future. Despite income and educational level, the same applies for a 9-year-old who's trying to be an assassin or a hawk, as we call them in Mexico, to someone with 40 years old with a master's degree or a PhD that has all its necessities perfectly covered, but who would like to have more income. In this leads us to certain questions, and I will leave the analysis here due to our time. We have assets needed and missing. World efforts have been very strong related to information sharing. We have learned to follow the money trail, which is very necessary to hinder corruption efforts. We have a lot of cooperation through security and legal institutions worldwide. And that is why it is paramount to modify society's perception regarding transnational organized crime and continue its combat. If we don't do this, then all the efforts aforementioned will actually not reach social success. Society cannot change its perception about transnational organized crime power or presence in every single affair in their life without a credible governmental response. And one of the most pressing issues that we're having today while combating organized crime organization has been a lack of a counter narrative able to permeate society and strengthen democratic and civil values. While today, sadly to say, organized crime even reached the entertainment industry, states have failed systematically to bring forward a consensual and negotiated approach to foster compliance with the rule of law by society's standards and views. Effectiveness of judicial processes and attacking corruption anti-values needs are paramount. The state successes need to be better, need to have better marketing for society to change its perception and counter corruption subcultures that we know favor organized crime at its core. And of course, transnational crime narrative is very strong and appealing to diverse sectors of society. That is why it's paramount to cripple it in order to remove its perception of invulnerability that today has gained throughout the massive killings, its economical gain, and of course, its geographical spreading. And that is why the state capture process that corruption and impunity are presenting, they can actually be hindered at some point with a very strong counter narrative, along with all the other efforts that we've mentioned, the ones made in public security, the ones made in intelligence and security institutions. And those must be attached to judicial processes successes and money restriction if we don't want to go that path, reigning in the 21st century. And with this thought, I would like to end the sharing of my thoughts today. Thank you very much.
Alfonso, really very nice presentation. I have one question that I couldn't avoid. You mentioned counter narrative and the importance to work on this point. I think that usually governments works more in counter narrative when we think in terrorism, counter terrorism activities. But governments don't work so much in counter narrative in criminal organizations. Really, what idea do you have to work a counter narrative? Really, it's very important, and it's not usual that speakers talk about this point. Very nice. What is your idea? What should be?
I totally agree with you when we say that most of the times counter narrative comes from what we've learned from terrorism. But I would like to again draw from Selena's presentation, because we need a very strong commitment between private sector, government authorities, and civil society in order to create it. If the counter narrative starts in each one of these three, but does not have the support of the other two, most likely it will fail. And the counter narrative needs to be needs to be constructed while governments are marketing better its own successes against transnational organized crime and by leading with example. And that can also happen with the private sector. Societies are always looking for role models to follow. And if that is not happening, then there is no stimuli for societies actually to change. Even if we have organized civil society doing this, we know that some of those times their efforts can be restricted due precisely to corruption efforts. And there is a very specific need for the three sectors to get together and create that counter narrative, one that actually honors the rule of law. And most of the times, which is not mentioned, the benefits of living under this very specific rule. Because when we tackle organized crime in marketing efforts, what people used to set up is what is negative about organized crime, but they never mention what is actually positive about following rules, about not following corruption, and about putting efforts that will support nations projects. And I think that's the core, one of the core components that we need to foster in this 21st century. Thank you very much, Fernando.
I have one last question, and we are going to do final reflections, final conclusions. Ailey, I ask, which is your opinion about the government of López Obrador in the context of organized crime and the new strategy on the issue of security? Do you understand the question?
Yeah. Well, Gabriela actually set up a couple of ideas regarding this. In my opinion, I would like to wait to see the program for national security come through in order to have a better view of what politics can be in this present government, just like it will be happening in other ones around. So I'm sorry I cannot go further in this, but I would like to wait a little bit more to see the strategic documents that will be backing up this present administration.
Okay. Alfonso, thank you very much, and congratulations again. We are finishing this activity today. We are going to give more seminars related to organized crime, and for example, but what is important from today? Today we can talk about general considerations, and especially your presentation, Alfonso, and the presentation that give us Selina, very good presentation too. And we can think about these general processes, how impact in each country. In special, for example, today we talk about Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. I know that many of the considerations that speakers today gave us could be used for other countries, but the important is to put light over this process. Alfonso, you speak very clearly how is the process and how criminal organized crime, how can affect one country, how can you say put under siege, and that's the really point. I am very happy, and in relation to the general considerations we speakers gave us today, we have to think about the impact of the COVID-19. Gabriela perhaps could give us any final comments about this topic. Gabriela from Mexico. What do you think? Gabi?
Well, talking about COVID-19, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Speak. Hello.
Yes, Gabriela, yes.
Yes.
Now, Fernando, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Well, as I was saying about COVID-19, I think that we are going to have a great impact, taking into consideration what Selena was explaining us at the very beginning of the presentation. Since the flow of money is going to stop eventually because of the in Mexico specifically, I think that increase of high impact crimes such as kidnapping, extortion, and robbery, many forms of robbery. This is because when I was an intelligence officer between 2010 and 2012, we observed that when the federal police or the Mexican armed forces striked criminal organization, the flow of money stopped. So in order to become self-sustainable cells, these mini groups, these small groups started to develop some other criminal activities, such as criminal or what we call in Mexico virtual extortion. That is extortion by using a telephone, and also virtual kidnapping. So I believe that is going to be the first problem that we are going to face, a high increase of these high impact crimes. On the other hand, Alfonso talked about something that is very, very important, that is social mobility. The economical crisis that is here caused by the pandemic is going to make slower the social mobility. And people is going to turn their perspectives and their necessities to some other options, like organized crime. I think that people is going to find as a solution to become a part of these groups in order to get money faster. And this belief that is easier. However, being a member of organized crime is a lie that is easy money. It's a very dangerous job. And it's very hard. It's not easy money at all. But it's going to be an option for the people that it's going to face this economical crisis. And I think also that the biggest problem, the biggest threat that all governments and many countries of Latam are going to face is what I call the void of the state. With less money and more complex problems besides organized crime, the state, the government specifically, are not going to be able to be in every single corner of every single country. So these voids are going to be taken by the organized crime by satisfying necessities, not only about security, but about food, about money, about social services that must be covered by the state. But today, with the efforts focused on the pandemic, it's almost impossible. So the problem is absolutely complex. Of course, we need to analyze it through the crystal of national security and citizen security. But we also need to understand that this is a complex social problem, and we need to understand it by the vision of sciences, social sciences like criminology, sociology, anthropology, because if we do not start to think out of the box, we are not going to be as resilient and as adaptive as organized crime are currently.
Thank you very much, Gabi, for the final conclusion. I thank all the audience, and we are very happy to be here. I invite next Monday. We are going to do a similar seminar. We have one ex-former from the DIA, one ex-former from the NCIS, and we have one former official from the Naval Albanian Service. It will be a seminar related to organized crime too, from a European perspective. I thank especially to Alejandro Perugorria because all these technical issues could be supported by him. And no more. Thank you so much. Tomorrow we are going to have another seminar with the former Minister of Security in Argentina, Patricia Bullrich. We are going to give another seminar. We are going to talk with personalities that worked from high spheres of the security, and we want to know their experience, their perspectives about this problem and other problems related with security. Thank you very much, and we wait you tomorrow and the next Monday. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Congratulations.
Bye-bye, bye-bye.
Gracias, Alejandro. Sí.
Gracias, Alfonso. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, Alejandro. See you soon.
Gracias a todos.